Hello, everyone. Welcome to the event this evening. This is the first of the Civil Liberties College tour. My name is Tanner DeLawyer, and I'm the head of recruitment here for the local chapter of the Young Americans for Liberty. A little bit about what we do. We put on events in order to promote the cause of liberty here in the University of Washington campus and in the Seattle community. And we'll be having events throughout the year. If you're a student here, please make sure to sign the sign-up sheet outside, and you can help get involved and promote liberty here at UW. So this evening, our moderator is going to be Jack Hunter. We've got three distinguished speakers here. Glenn Greenwald, who is representing the liberal side. Jacob Hornberger, the libertarian. And finally, Bruce. My button apparently fell off. Finally, Bruce Fine, who is representing the conservative opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanner. I certainly appreciate that introduction. I appreciate Young Americans for Liberty and the Future of Freedom Foundation for putting this event on. As you can tell, I'm a native of your great state, Washington, here. From my accent, you can tell that I'm from these parts. It's the first time I've been to Seattle. I've had an absolutely great time so far. The weather's beautiful, but really enjoyed it. Judge Andrew Napolitano in August wrote the following at Fox News, quote, "Gazillions. That's the number of times the federal government has spied on Americans since 9/11, through the use of drones, legal search warrants, illegal warrants, federal agent written search warrants, and just plain government spying. This is according to Senator Rand Paul, who, when he asked the government to tell him what it was doing to violate our privacy, was giving a classified briefing." Now, the number gazillions obviously is a very big number. Senator Paul is not allowed to use any accurate number in speaking in public, so that's what he uses, and it is sort of an accurate description of just how much the government spies on us in a post-9/11 America. Now, for many people, this was sort of, something that was invented, at least in the last decade, by George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, right? The Patriot Act started this ball rolling. Government spying and executive power. Well, you would think with this guy that we have for president now, with hope and change, things were supposed to get better. He even made some of those promises. Well, a report released by the ACLU this month has shown us just how bad things have gotten, how it's gotten worse as it relates to government spying. Reported the ACLU, quote, "Justice Department's documents released by the ACLU reveal that federal law enforcement agencies are increasingly monitoring Americans' electronic communications and doing so without warrants, sufficient oversight, or meaningful accountability." Now, a lot of people in this room already knew this. How bad as it got, the ACLU continued. It reported that between 2009 and 2011, the number of people subjected to just telephone wiretapping had doubled or tripled, depending on the category. The government conducted more telephone surveillance in those 2 years than it had in the entire previous decade. The ACLU continues. It gets worse. As far as snooping through your email, the ACLU reported that the number of authorizations the Justice Department received to use a certain device to conduct internet surveillance increased 361% from 2009 to 2011. That's what hope and change brought us from changing from the Bush and Cheney administration policies. Now, these government spying policy numbers, the statistics I just mentioned from the ACLU, and the gazillions that people like Senator Rand Paul mentioned and Judge Andrew Napolitano cite, are just one area where our government has gotten completely out of control when it comes to attacking civil liberties. Obviously, we know about the Patriot Act during the Bush era. Then we have the National Defense Authorization Act in this era. If you thought it was bad that you could throw people in jail for indefinite detention under the Patriot Act, well, Obama has one-upped Bush. Now you can throw American citizens in jail, indefinite detention. That's even worse than what his predecessor did. It keeps getting worse and worse. We have issues nowadays that are sort of new, like internet freedom, which I think is a civil liberties issue, where the government just can't wait to regulate the internet. Across the board, executive power. Look at how much power was assumed not only during the Bush era, but the Obama era, and executive power, enhancing that branch, and issuing executive orders that the Founding Fathers would have certainly called tyranny. Well, civil liberties are under assault from across the board, and it is a bipartisan assault. That's the purpose of the discussion we're going to have here tonight. That this isn't about left and right or conservative and liberal and Republican and Democrat, but it is to the extent that all of the assaults are coming from across the political spectrum. Nobody, is... as much as we're attacked from Republicans on civil liberties when Bush was in office, we see the same thing from Democrats when Obama's in office. And it's interesting, we see a lot of the same defenses coming from a bipartisan effort. If you have the ACLU, who's considered on the left, sort of standing up for the Fourth Amendment, you have people like Senator Rand Paul or Congressman Ron Paul or even Senator Jim DeMint from my home state who are against the NDAA when a Democratic administration is trying to push it. So tonight we are also going to hear from people from across the political spectrum. If you'll allow me to introduce tonight's guests, Glenn Greenwald. Glenn Greenwald is a columnist for The Guardian, a former constitutional and civil rights litigator, and is the author of 2 New York Times best-selling books on the Bush. Greenwald was named by The Atlantic as one of the most 25 influential political commentators in the nation. He is the recipient of the first annual I.F. Stone Award for Independent Journalism and is the winner of the 2010 Online Journalism Association Award for his investigative work on the arrest and oppressive detention of Bradley Manning. Glenn going to call the liberal perspective. Jacob Hornberger is going to be speaking from the libertarian perspective. Mr. Hornberger is founder and president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. He received his BA degree in economics from VMI, the Virginia Military Institute, and his law degree from the University of Texas. He was a civil and criminal trial attorney in Texas for 12 years and also served as an adjunct professor of law and economics at the University of. He is a regular libertarian commentator in multiple places, and you might have saw him a lot on Judge Andrew Napolitano's Freedom Watch when it was still on Fox Business. And last but certainly not least, representing the conservative perspective is Bruce Fein. Mr. Fein graduated from Harvard Law School with honors in 1972. After a coveted federal judicial clerkship, he joined the U.S. Department of Justice, where he served as Assistant Director of the Office of Legal Policy and a legal advisor to the Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust and the Associate Deputy Attorney General. He has authored several volumes on the United States Supreme Court, the U.S. Constitution, and international law. You know, you're going to hear from each of these speakers here this evening, and afterwards we're going to have a very lengthy and hopefully entertaining question and answer session. So first, I wish you would give a grand welcome to Mr. Jacob Hornberger.
Well, thank you very much, and it's really nice to be here with y'all. This is actually part 2 of our College Civil Liberties Tour. We did one out on the East Coast last winter, and it was just the 3 of us plus Jack being the moderator, and it was just such a high for us that we said, hey, let's take this tour out west. And it's nice to be kicking it off here at the University of Washington. When we were at Columbia University, when we kicked off part 1 of the tour, a lady came up to me and she said, oh, I can't wait to hear the debate tonight. And I said, well, where's the debate? And she says, well, here. And she said, well, you know, she was thinking we got a libertarian, a liberal, and a conservative. I mean, what else could it be but a debate, right? And ironically, about a week ago, a guy called me and he says, hey, I'm coming out to your debate at, you know, one of the venues this week. And I said, we're not having a debate. He says, oh, you got to have a debate. I mean, you're libertarian, liberal, and conservative. Well, there is no debate. You see, while the 3 of us will have our philosophical differences, obviously, and while we have differences in other areas, when it comes to this particular issue, civil liberties, the war on terrorism, foreign policy, we're on the same page. It doesn't matter that one's a liberal, one's a conservative, or one's a libertarian. We all share basically the same perspective. And we all share the same conviction that this is the most important issue facing every single one of us in our lifetime. It trumps every other issue. Now, how can that be? Well, let's describe the kind of society that we live in. It's really the society that most of you here that are students have grown up with. You know what, were you 9, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old when 9/11 hit? So you've grown your entire teenage years in this way of life that we now call normal, that we call freedom. Right? I mean, you know, isn't that what's inculcated in you in school, that you live in a free society, that you're an American, and that you're different, you're exceptional, because you're grateful. I mean, you live in a free society. The troops are overseas fighting for our freedoms. We wouldn't have this assembly here if the troops weren't over there. There wouldn't be baseball games and troops over there fighting for our freedoms, right? Isn't this what's been inculcated in every single one of you? I mean, we got the same stuff when I was growing up. Instead of terrorism, it was communism. From the first grade on up, man. Oh, man, the communists are coming to get us. God, stay fearful. Look under your bed because there's communists under the bed. And look at the kind of society that they describe as freedom. We live in a country in which the military now wields the power to take any American citizen into custody as long as they relate it to terrorism and cart him away to a concentration camp or a military dungeon. That's an incredible power. I mean, to put things in context, that is a power that has existed in the most powerful dictatorships in history. The power of a chief executive, a president, a ruler, a dictator, to simply send his military forces out among the citizenry and pick them up. And even if a citizen is acquitted in a federal court by a jury of his peers of an act of terrorism, we now live in a country where the military can sit right there inside that courtroom, and as soon as that jury comes back in with a not guilty verdict, take that person into custody, cart him away, and torture him. Execute him, perhaps after some kangaroo tribunal, the kind that exists now at Guantanamo and existed for some 11 years. That's not the kind of country that the framers had in mind when they brought this federal government into existence with the Constitution. It's the farthest thing they ever had in mind. Now, U.S. officials say, well, we really didn't have a choice. 9/11, 9/11 changed the world. As if this terrorist attack gave rise to these powers. Where in the Constitution does it say that? You see, the Constitution is the document that not only called the federal government into existence, we the people call the government into existence, it's our servant, it also sets forth what its powers are. Show me a power that says in an emergency you have the right now to send the military out and seize citizens. Where does it even say that if there's an emergency you get new powers? It doesn't say that. And the reason it doesn't say it is because the framers knew that emergencies are always the excuse for governments to exercise tyrannical powers. It's the perfect time to take on these extraordinary emergency powers because people are afraid. People are panicking. It is the most dangerous time as far as the freedom and the well-being of the people are concerned. I mean, look at the dictatorial. When you saw the protesters out there protesting, get that their government relinquish the exact same powers that the U.S. government assumed on 9/11. The power of the military and the intelligence force to take people into custody, cart them away to an Egyptian torture chamber, torture them, execute them. What they were demanding, that Mubarak, the dictator of that country, relinquish those powers. They're still demanding that those powers be relinquished with this new president who has refused to relinquish them. And how did those powers come into existence? Through an emergency 30 years ago, an assassination of the president of the country. I mean, we ought to count ourselves lucky. Our temporary emergency powers have gone on for only 11 years. Theirs have gone on for 30-something.
Sorry, Jake, can you run a wire to the
They've gone on for 30 years there. But that gives you the context. I mean, imagine here in America, the government's is wielding. That's incredible. That is not the America that the framers, the founding fathers, thought they were bringing into existence. Now they say, well, 9/11 changed the world. But you know what they never want to get into on 9/11 is why. Why'd those people strike the United States? You know, that's something that they don't want in Washington, us regular people, to analyze and talk about. In fact, what was the first thing they said after 9/11? The terrorists just hate us for our freedom and values, right? They were just an innocent little babe in the woods, and the terrorists are like the flu. Oh my gosh, now we've been struck by the flu. It's our turn to have terrorism, and they just hate us because of rock and roll and our Catholic and Protestant churches. Ridiculous. And that goes, of course, to the concept of motive. They struck because they were angry, because they were filled with rage. In fact, if you go back to 1979, now every one of you knows what's going on in Iran, right? You got this brutal regime of sanctions that the U.S. government is imposing against Iran, squeezing the lifeblood out of the Iranian people. They're losing their life savings. 1979, the Iranian people had a revolution, and they took American diplomats hostage. Held them hostage. They kidnapped them for a year or more. Why? They said, U.S. officials said, they're just, people that they're crazy and they hate us, and they just took these hostages because they just hate us. Ridiculous. Because you see, what really happened was that the U.S. government destroyed Iran's experiment with democracy. You want to know why there's no democracy in Iran? Because the U.S. government destroyed it. 1953, 25 years before that, the CIA went into Iran and ousted in a coup, secretly, their democratically elected prime minister. And then they installed one of the most brutal dictators in history, the Shah of Iran. And they helped train his secret police force, the Savak, on how to torture his own people and how to oppress them. What the CIA had done. And they had been suffering under this brutal dictatorship for 25 years. And they said, enough's enough. Enough of the torture chambers. And they had a revolution. And they ousted leadership that the Shah. And they were angry. And that's why they took those diplomats hostage. Now, we can all sit here and say it's not justified, they violated international law, all of which may be true. But what we're here talking about is motive. What is it that motivates people to be so anti-American? And the answer always points back to the U.S. government. Before 9/11, there were the same sanctions we see against Iran today. It's a repeat. WMDs, oh my gosh, they're going to attack America. Mushroom clouds over American cities. Everybody's supposed to get afraid. Where are the color codes? That's the one thing I'm disappointed is they've dropped all the color codes, Because fear is the coin of the realm. Well, what they were doing to the Iraqis is they were killing children. Killing children with these things. They were squeezing the lifeblood out of the Iraqi economy, same way they're doing the Iranian economy. There wasn't any medicine to take care of the children. They were dying of malnutrition, of hunger, of infectious illnesses. Tens of thousands. 2 high UN officials resigned in protest. They called it genocide. Every year, tens of thousands of people. But you see, the mindset of U.S. officials were, we're doing this for the benefit of the Iraqi people. We're helping them. We're bringing them democracy. We're ousting Saddam Hussein from power, a dictator who, by the way, used to be a pro-U.S. dictator in the 1980s when they were furnishing him those infamous WMDs. But now they turned on him. And they were using the citizens by squeezing them and squeezing their children in the hopes that they would oust Saddam Hussein from power. The citizens were the means. And U.S. officials, many of them really believed they were doing good. I mean, I went to a program recently, and it was just shocking. One U.S. official was there commenting on what this lady who had written about the sanctions, and it was just fascinating watching his mindset. And he was bringing democracy and freedom to the Iraqi people. And the cost was his children. When Madeleine Albright, who was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, okay, she's the official representative to the United Nations on behalf of the U.S. government, 60 Minutes asks her, says, it's been reported that 500,000 Iraqi children have died. What do you say about this? And Albright expressed the mindset of Washington, of the federal government. She says, well, it's a tough issue, but yeah, it's worth it. How can that not make people angry? And it did make people angry. That's why they suspected that Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11, because they were convinced he was the most likely culprit, that Iraqis would be the most likely people that were angry. But that rage was boiling all through the Middle East. In the meantime, they were over here prosecuting Americans who were taking medicines in. There's a man here this evening, Bert Sachs, who was heroic, taking medicines in to the Iraqi people. They fined him $10,000, which he heroically fought for umpteen years, and he beat them. They went after Iraqi Americans who were sending money to their families, and all the while saying, we're doing this for the Iraqis. And that rage was boiling, and we said it at the Future of Freedom Foundation before 9/11. We said, if you don't stop this, you're going to see terrorism on American soil. And we weren't the only ones. There was a scholar named Chalmers Johnson, whose books I highly recommend to you. He was saying the same thing. He's got a great book called Blowback that was published before 9/11. And it didn't take a rocket scientist. There was the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in 1993. In principle, the same thing as what happened on 9/11, just not as successful from the terrorist standpoint. There was terrorist attacks on CIA officials outside CIA headquarters. There was a terrorist attacks on the U.S. embassies in East SS Cole. And some of us kept saying, you got to stop what you're doing. And they wouldn't stop it. They just kept doing it. Unconditional support to the Israeli government, regardless of what they would do to the Palestinians. Stationing of U.S. troops on Mecca and Medina, the holiest lands in the Muslim religion, humiliating people, angering people. Didn't come as a big surprise when 9/11 hit. Didn't come as a surprise to us. So where do we stand now? Well, they're just doing the same thing. The invasions, the occupations, the sanctions, the embargoes. 50-year embargo against Cuba, squeezing the lifeblood out of the Cuban people in some desperate hope they're going to oust the Castro brothers from power after 50 years. And the people who suffer are the citizens themselves. And so what we're here to talk about tonight is not just reforming this system. What we're here to talk about is a challenge to you. A challenge that questions the entire paradigm under which we're living. A paradigm of what we call the national security state that was brought into existence in 1947, the CIA, the vast military establishment. It's just a big racket. That's all it is, a big racket. They promised that as soon as the communist threat was dismantled, that they would dismantle, and they didn't do that. Instead, they went into the Middle East and started poking hornets' nests. And then they used 9/11 as the excuse to take away our freedoms, to impose its military power over us, and then the power of assassination. Imagine that. The power to assassinate Americans and foreigners with impunity. No trial, no due process. They have total, omnipotent, non-reviewable power to kill whoever they want. Just call them a terrorist. And so what we're here talking about is challenging people to restore a free society to our land. That this notion that's inculcated in all of us from the first grade, that this is freedom, that the troops are protecting our freedom, balderdash. It's not freedom at all. It's the antithesis of freedom. And that once you recognize that, once you recognize this is not a free society, then the question is, do you want a free society? And then the question is, if you answer that yes, then what do you do about it? There are few forces in the universe more powerful than ideas on liberty and the quest of a people who want to be free. Nothing scares them more than a small group of determined people with passion and a commitment to end injustice and to end abuse and to end humiliation of people and to restore a free society to our land. And that's the challenge we bring to you, is to raise your vision to a higher level, to say nothing is inevitable. They will tell you this is permanent. This is going to last for the rest of your life. Nonsense. Nothing is inevitable. If you look at how the Berlin Wall came down, you look at this Arab Spring, a small group of determined people can bring down injustice and it can restore freedom to our land. And that's what we're calling on you to do. Because you have this. As youth, you have principles, you have ideals, you have a passion to end wrongdoing, and we call on you to rise to the occasion and join us in one of the greatest causes in the history of this country. And that cause is the restoration of civil liberties to our land. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacob Hornberger. Our next speaker, I sort of gave the formal introductions earlier. This will be a little bit more informal. Recently left Salon to write for the UK Guardian, some of the best writing on the subject of civil liberties. In my opinion and many others' opinions, his great book, How Would a Patriot Act? And as Jacob pointed over on the way here, if the government ever decided to get rid of the First Amendment and start cracking down on dissent, our next speaker would probably be target number one, public enemy number one. Ladies and gentlemen, Glenn Greenwald.
Good evening. I'm going to actually stand behind here because if I start walking out into the audience, I start feeling like Oprah or something, so I'm just going to station myself right here. As Jacob said, this is sort of the sequel to our Civil Liberties Tour. We toured several colleges and universities on the East Coast and in the Midwest earlier this year and found it a great success. And one of the things that we found was that the most vibrant and constructive part was often the question and answer session at the end. So we're all going to try very diligently to confine ourselves to 20 minutes or so in these initial presentations, which in turn means that I'm going to try and focus in a very concise way on what I think are the crux of the most important issues really worth discussing. And to begin with that, I want to ask the question, pose the question. The title of this tour is a Civil Liberties Tour, and I think it's really constructive to ask first, before we talk about anything else, what is it that we even mean when we talk about the term civil liberties? What is it that that term denotes? And the reason I think it's while to do that, and in fact kind of important to do it, is because civil liberties is one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot. There are lots of terms like it in our political discourse that people don't spend much time thinking about in terms of the definition of it, or what is it that we're signifying or referring to when we use the term. And the really good thing about this exercise, about thinking about what the term civil liberties means, is it's actually not that complex of a concept. It's really actually pretty simple and clear. All we really mean when we talk about civil liberties is the list of limitations that we have imposed on the government regarding what it is that it can do to us and how it exercises its power. That's all civil liberties really are. It's just the limitations that as a citizenry we've imposed on the government in exchange for recognizing the exertion of their power, their state power, as being legitimate and valid. And the really good thing about that concept, about this list of limitations, is we don't have to search very hard for it. It's not like a scavenger hunt is needed to find this list. Fortunately, they're all compiled in a single place, in a single document even, called the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. And the additionally very good thing about this concept is that the limitations that are all found in this document are themselves not particularly complex or difficult to understand. They too are actually quite clear, and not only are they clear, but they're very absolutist in their expression of these limitations. So if you look at the First Amendment, it simply says Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. If you look at the Fourth Amendment, it says there shall be no unreasonable searches and seizures of our persons or papers without a search warrant issued only upon a finding of probable cause. If you look at the Fifth Amendment, it says that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. These are very clear and very absolutist prohibitions. I recall I once had this somewhat acrimonious exchange with Joe Klein, who's a writer at Time Magazine. And well, I've actually had many acrimonious exchanges with Joe Klein at Time Magazine, but there's one in particular that I'm thinking. We had a sort of week or 2 week long debate, fight/confrontation over civil liberties issues. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it got pretty confrontational and pretty heated. And at one point, in the middle of it, he wrote something, and in the middle of lashing out at me and accusing me of all sorts of... Greenwald is a civil liberties extremist. And I remember reading that, and I was actually genuinely baffled when I first read it, because I really didn't understand why in the midst of this extremely vociferous, kind of intense, angry, week-long dispute, he suddenly decided to compliment me like that. I was like, why is he being so nice all of a sudden? And then I actually realized a couple minutes later, no, actually he means that as an insult. Like, he thinks civil liberties extremist is a bad thing to be. And I was amazed by that, because I consider that to be the highest compliment that I can be paid, to be called a civil liberties extremist. In fact, I'm kind of thinking about having that on my tombstone, like, here lies a civil liberties extremist. And the reason why I consider that such a good thing is because if you look at this list of civil liberties, there's really no way to believe in them other than by being extremist about them, by believing that when these limitations have been imposed on government power, that those limitations are what they say they are, and that they're to be taken seriously, and that the government is required to adhere to them. And one of the reasons why it's so vital to talk about civil liberties and the state of civil liberties in the United States is precisely because it's that very list that is being so systematically violated, so violently breached by the U.S. government. So if you look, for example, at the First Amendment's prohibition on abridging free speech, you see over the last decade dozens of prosecutions, mostly of American Muslims, but increasingly non-Muslims as well, for doing things like uploading YouTube videos that are critical of U.S. foreign policy, and the government therefore says are designed to glorify and encourage support for terrorist organizations. Or if you look at the Fourth Amendment and its prohibition on searches and seizures without a probable cause search warrant, you see a massive surveillance state in which surveillance is conducted on all of us continuously without a whiff of judicial review or the issuance of search warrants. In fact, the surveillance state is so sprawling, so ubiquitous at this point, that even as somebody who writes about it frequently, as I do, sometimes I'm actually surprised by finding out just how pervasive it has become, so embedded into the woodwork of our political culture. I remember there was this incident, you probably remember this, about 5 years ago or so in 2007, where there was this really heinous shooting spree at Virginia Tech University by a student who it turned out was psychotic and psychiatric problems, and there was this ABC News report on the shooting that I was reading, and buried in the middle of the article, it said federal officials have told ABC News that there is no record of the accused shooter having taken any prescription drugs. And the reason why I was so alarmed by that and found that so bizarre was because I was wondering, how is it that the federal government could possibly know who it is who's taking prescription drugs and who isn't taking prescription drugs? And as I looked into that question, as it turns out, there 2 years earlier had been a federal law enacted that created a federal database mandating that every prescription that you buy, every time you fill a prescription or go to the drugstore to get a prescription, it goes into a federal database so that the federal government knows every single prescription that you fill at any given time. Not because you're guilty of anything, not because they have any suspicion of you, simply because they are constantly monitoring and surveilling even the most innocuous activities. I had a similar reaction. There was an incident 2 weeks ago at the LA airport. He was wearing a bulletproof vest as he tried to go through the security, and he was flying out of the country, and he was stopped by immigration. I guess they thought they didn't believe him that the bulletproof vest was really for fashion reasons, and they searched his luggage and they found things like body bags and leg cuffs and all sorts of things like that were going to be checked, smoke grenades as well. And so they ended up arresting him because the smoke grenade was found to be some sort of hazard. And the USA Today article about this incident said that federal officials told USA Today that this individual had no criminal record. He had never before been convicted of a crime, nor did he have what USA Today called a derogatory national security record. And I just found that concept so bizarre as well. What is the distinction between having a criminal record, which means that you've actually violated the law and therefore have a record of wrongdoing, and now there's this new realm called a derogatory national security record, which, as it turns out, probably means that the government, for some reason, has decided that something that you've done that is not criminal, protesting against the government, associating with groups the government considers subversive in some way, now creates a derogatory profile within the government that can put you on no-fly list or other forms of watch list. Something beyond the criminal law, something beyond due process, just another mechanism that the surveillance state uses to monitor and store information about what it is that we do. There was this Washington Post series from 2010. It was called Top Secret America. And it explored what it called this secret U.S. government. And there was a fact buried in it that has always stuck with me. And what it said was that the U.S. government every single day stores and monitors and stores 1.7 billion communications between and among American citizens every single day. Records of your telephone calls, your emails, every other form of electronic communication is automatically stored. So when you compare this massive ubiquitous surveillance state to what the Fourth Amendment says and guarantees that we shall not be subject to any searches of our persons or papers or homes without a probable cause search warrant, finding that we've done something wrong, you can see how violently it's being abridged. And then you look at the Fifth Amendment prohibition on no deprivation of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And over the past decade, what we see is the creation of a systematic prison system where people can be encaged permanently for decades without any charges of any kind, let alone convictions. That's what Guantanamo was, as well as the worldwide system of detention. And now you have, as Jacob alluded to, even the claim by the president, not just the claim, but the exercising of the power to target even American citizens for execution without any due process, as was done to the Yemeni-American cleric Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen, and then 2 weeks later, his 16-year-old son, Abdul Rahman. So if you try to imagine what could be the most violent fundamental breach of the Fifth Amendment prohibition, it would be exactly what we're seeing. Imprisonment on the say-so of the president without due process, and now even the ultimate deprivation of life, execution, assassination by CIA drone or any other means based only on the president's order in secret with no transparency or due process. So you see not just ancillary or isolated violations of this list of prohibitions of these civil liberties, but fundamental, ongoing, and radical ones. So I think it's worth asking, after we think about what we mean by civil liberties, is why it is that that has been happening and why it is that it continues to happen and seems to get worse every day without much of a citizenry backlash. And there's a few reasons that I think are worth thinking about. And the reason it's so important to think about why this is happening is to then understand how it can be stopped. So the first reason is that these repressive measures, these abridgments of liberty, are typically targeted at groups that are marginalized and powerless, and therefore other people who aren't in these marginalized, powerless groups don't care because they don't think it'll affect them. And this is always the history of how governments typically seize repressive power, is they target the most marginalized and unsympathetic group in the country on the grounds that if they legitimize the power there, the rest of the citizenry will stand by passively, thinking that it doesn't affect them. And of course, that group over the last decade, there have been lots of groups in American history that have served that role. The group in the last decade that has served it primarily is American Muslims. And what you have is the belief that as long as it's only being directed towards them, there's no real reason to fight it because it won't actually affect me and abridge my freedom. Now, if you just leave to the side the grotesque immorality of only caring about injustices when they directly affect you and not caring about them when they don't, just leave that to the side. Just as a pragmatic view, that perspective is incredibly irrational, because the way in which civil liberties abuses work, the way in which the governments always seize abuse of power, is that they never confine the abuse of power to their original application. It always expands. Not sometimes, not usually, always expands beyond the original application. So if you look at, for example, the Patriot Act and how that was justified in the name of terrorism, you see over the last decade the Patriot Act being used in cases overwhelmingly that has nothing to do with terrorism. If you look at FBI tactics that have been used to entrap Muslims into crimes that they wouldn't have otherwise committed, whether it be using agent provocateurs to urge them to commit crimes or having paid informants try and persuade them to do so, what you now see is that being used against groups far outside of the Muslim community as well, whether it be anarchists or people who are protesting against NATO or the Occupy movement, has all seen those type of powers directed at them as well. And if you listen to American national security officials, it's really quite remarkable, quite striking how they've changed their rhetoric over the past 10 years. So 7 or 8 or 9 years ago, they used to talk about the greatest American national security threat being Al-Qaeda and foreign terrorism. Now, if you listen to what they say, they will say the greatest American national security threat is what they call homegrown terrorism. And as a result, many of the repressive measures created to address that alleged threat involve not asserting American power and the power of the president on foreign soil, but on domestic soil as well. Jacob talked about the NDAA, Jack mentioned that as well, the ability to detain people on American soil. You see these measures that were once confined or largely applied to foreign Muslims outside of the United States gradually being applied on American soil to lots of different forms of American descent. Abuse of power never stays confined to its original application. The problem is that if you acquiesce to the abuse of power on the grounds that it's confined only to this marginalized group that doesn't affect you, then the power becomes legitimized. It becomes institutionalized. And once it's legitimized and once it's institutionalized, there's never any way to fight it once it starts expanding, as it inevitably does. But that's one reason why it's happening, because of the perception that it applies only to this marginalized group. The second reason that it's happening with such efficacy is because it's taking place in the context of endless war. And that makes civil liberties abuses much more potent and much more difficult to combat. And that's true for a couple of reasons. One is that war is the time when rulers and leaders exert the greatest power. In fact, that's generally the time when their power exists without limits. And that's because on a battlefield, there is no such thing as law. You don't have to give due process or charges to soldiers on the other side. If you want to shoot them, you simply shoot them. If you want to kill or execute your own soldier for cowardice or desertion, you simply execute them there on the spot. They don't get a full trial. It's battlefield justice. In war, leaders have no real limitations on their power. Bruce is fond of quoting Cicero 2,000 years ago, who famously said that when war begins, the law falls mute. So in times of war, it becomes much more difficult to argue for constraints on the power of rulers. And what has been particularly radical about the war on terror and its theories of power is that whereas before this ubiquitous omnipotence of rulers to exert power on a battlefield has now been expanded to the entire world based on the theory that there is no finite battlefield any longer, that the entire world, even US soil, is one big battlefield. So this limitless power that rulers could assert in a battlefield previously is now power that can be asserted everywhere in the world. But the other aspect of what makes war such a potent force in abridging civil liberties is that the number one tactic of a government when it's at war, the most important thing it does, is that it dehumanizes the target of the violence. And this is critical for any government because no society will tolerate, other than the most sociopathic citizenries, no society will tolerate a decade's worth of constant killing and slaughtering and murdering of innocent men, women, and children unless the humanity of the victims is disappeared, is simply denied. And you see this in all sorts of ways. You barely ever hear about the impact of American bombs or drone attacks or night raids on the people who it actually kills, on the people whose lives it devastates, and that's done by design. You have had reporters come back from war and they've talked about how the number one taboo in American media coverage is humanizing the victims of American violence. And that, again, has largely been Muslims. The New York Times reported 2 months ago that the Obama administration has actually formally adopted a definition of militant that says that a militant is any military-age male, meaning someone over 16 or under 55, who happens to be in a strike zone. Basically, any male who dies when an American bomb detonates is by definition a militant. This is the message conveyed over and over and over again, that the target of our violence, the target of this repression, are people who basically are not human beings. They are at best militants or terrorists, and therefore probably deserve it. And once you create that mindset where a group of people and their humanity has been denied, then the citizenry is willing to acquiesce to almost anything done in the name of undermining or constraining them. And then the third issue that I think is worth noting about why this is happening, and this to me probably is the most significant one and the most underappreciated one, is the effect that partisan allegiance has on generating support for these policies. There was this amazingly interesting report in 2008 that was prepared by the CIA, and it was ultimately leaked by WikiLeaks. And one of the things that this report talked about was the CIA was extremely concerned in 2008 because Western Europeans were turning against the war in Afghanistan, and a couple of Western European governments had fallen because of their involvement in the war. And that was putting pressure on other larger Western European governments to pull out of Afghanistan, to placate their populations that were growing tired of this decade-long conflict. And the CIA report talked about how the number one chance, the best chance for reversing this trend and for preventing it from spreading to the United States was the election of Barack Obama, which the CIA had assumed in 2008 was likely. And the reason the CIA thought that that was the most important asset for reversing this trend, for arresting growing opposition to the war, was because unlike George Bush, who was perceived as this sort of swaggering cowboy unilateralist, Obama would get into office, he would then embrace this war, it would become his war, he would advocate for it and justify it, and his prettier, kinder, progressive constitutional law phase that was incredibly appealing to Western Europeans, but also to Americans as well who had been opposed to the war, would convert public opinion from opposition to the war to support for the war. They would start to see Obama and his goodness as essentially reflecting on the war. It would repackage the war in a positive way. And that absolutely has worked, not only in the context of American aggression and militarism, but also in the context of these civil liberties abuses as well. I know just from personal experience that if 4 years ago I had stood up in a room and talked about the things I'm talking about now and condemned the policy that I'm condemning tonight, 50% of the room, if you just randomly assembled Americans into this room, 50% of the room would be incredibly hostile to what I was saying, would hate me, would be very resistant to the message that I was conveying. Those were called Republicans. And 50% of the room, the other 50%, would be incredibly supportive. They would cheer, they would say, great job, you're defending all the things that are so important to us, and you're defending the Constitution, all the things that make Americans great, and those were called Democrats. If you 4 years later assembled that exact same room, 90% of that room would hate me. Maybe like 80% if I were lucky, 85%, and only 10 to 15% would is that what were once years ago called in Democratic Party circles the shredding of the Constitution and the war on all of our American values, and where the symbol of right-wing radicalism has been converted into bipartisan consensus, because they are now not only the policies of the Republican Party as they were 4 years ago, but also the Democratic Party as well. The Democratic Party and its leader, who pretended to oppose these policies have now embraced them and taken along a substantial citizenry with them and have entrenched these policies far beyond what George Bush and Dick Cheney ever could have dreamed of doing. And I just want to just make 2 points about that. One is that historically, there's some really interesting research that has been done by a law professor at Yale, Jack Balkin, about how when certain policies get transformed from the policy of one party into the policy of two parties, they get removed from the realm of what gets debated and they become basically embedded into American political culture and impervious to challenge. And he cites some examples like when FDR ushered in his New Deal, the Republican Party and the conservatives of that time had as their primary goal uprooting the New Deal, and yet when the first Republican president after FDR, Dwight Eisenhower, basically did nothing more than tinker around the edges of the New Deal became a permanent fixture in American life because it was no longer FDR's liberalism and radicalism, it was now bipartisan consensus. And the same thing happened in the 1960s when the Goldwater conservatives were intent upon destroying Lyndon Johnson's Great Society reforms, and then Richard Nixon, the first Republican president after Johnson, got into office and actually became quite a liberal on the domestic front. He expanded lots of those programs, expanded the power of the government in the domestic realm, and those Great Society programs became a permanent fixture. What only 4 years ago was known as George Bush and Dick Cheney's right-wing radical assault on the Constitution, it is now entrenched as bipartisan consensus, therefore removed from political debate and probably protected for at least a generation. And just to give one example of that, just think about the controversies that led Democrats and progressives and liberals in the United States just a few short years ago to run around screaming all angrily and hysterically about the attack on the Constitution and the war being waged on American values. It was things like George Bush's claim that he had the power to detain people without charges, or to eavesdrop on American citizens without judicial review, without first going to a court and getting a FISA warrant. Here we are 3 years later, and the current president has asserted the power not merely to detain Americans without due process, although he does do that, and not only to eavesdrop on our conversations without judicial review, though he does that too, he's asserted the power to target us for assassination without due process or charges or going to a court. And yet there is very little backlash or upheaval over this far more radical and extremist power. This is the way in which these radical extremist policies have been transformed into bipartisan consensus. It is a major reason why there's great difficulty in fighting these things. So I just want to end by talking about the two most significant implications that I think we see from allowing the government to violate this list of limitations that we've imposed on it, that really the founders imposed on it as a means of avoiding having the tyranny that they fought a war to liberate themselves from replicated. There's lots of implications from allowing the government to do this the way we've done. Obviously, we lose basic rights. If we lose free speech rights, we lose the ability to gather together and protest injustices. If we lose the ability to be free of government searches without a search warrant, we lose the right to privacy. If we lose the right of life and liberty and property without due process, we empower the government in all sorts of ways. Those are obvious implications. But there's a couple less obvious implications that I think are probably more important than those that I just want to focus on for a minute. One of those is the way in which radicalism becomes very quickly normalized. And I just want to focus on one example that illustrates what I mean by that. If you think about back to the weeks after September 11th. The climate in the country after September 11th was incredibly acquiescent. The media, the citizenry, Congress, every institution that was supposed to check the president basically was willing to give the president anything he wanted because of the perception of this crisis. And even in that climate, when the Patriot Act was introduced by the Bush administration and then it became clear that Congress would enact it, even in this climate where we were willing to give the government every benefit of the doubt, there was great controversy over the Patriot Act, even in mainstream circles. If you go back and read op-eds from large newspapers, even the statements of mainstream members of Congress, you'll see all kinds of warnings and denunciations about the Patriot Act, that it expanded detention and surveillance wildly and radically beyond what we should tolerate as a citizenry. So effective were these warnings, so widespread were these concerns about the Patriot Act and how radical it was, that even the Congress, as compliant as they were in the weeks after 9/11, inserted a provision into the Patriot Act that said that the powers we're vesting with this law shall expire within 4 years. The reason being that we don't want these powers to become a permanent part of our political identity. We're only vesting them because of the crisis that we face. Once the crisis is over in 4 years, we want these powers to expire and everything to return to normal. And yet 4 years later, in 2005, there was a vote about whether to extend the Patriot Act, and it passed by something like 89-10. Even in the face of abundant evidence that all kinds of abuses had taken place, you could barely find any member of the United States Congress willing to stand up and oppose its extension. And then 4 years after that, in 2009, when it came time to extend it again, the Obama administration demanded its extension without any kind of reforms, and a handful of senators, led ironically by Rand Paul, opposed the extension of the Patriot Act on the grounds that it was abusive and needed reforms. He was accused by Harry Reid of risking a terrorist attack, accused of having blood on his hands if he succeeds in impeding this critical piece of legislation. The Democrats had perfectly co-opted Karl Rove's rhetoric, and the Patriot Act passed with almost any notice whatsoever. The Patriot Act, only 9 years, incredibly controversial. 9 years later, nobody talks about the Patriot Act. There's no controversy or even notice. When it comes time to extend it, it's become a permanent part of our political identity. It has simply faded into the woodwork. The same is true, as I just said, with controversies that were once in the Bush administration that almost seemed quaint. The idea can detain people or eavesdrop on us without going to a court first. Nobody cares about that. The president has now gone so much further, the current one has, and asserted the power to assassinate American citizens. This shows how, and what is radical in just a few short years, by becoming normalized, just gets accepted and becomes an acceptable part of our political culture. That, I think, is a major implication of allowing these civil liberties abuses to continue. The last implication that I want to talk about is, I think, the most important one, and the reason why civil liberties should be defended with all of our vigor. And that is this: the ideal situation in a free society, really the hallmark of a free society, is that the people who exert power do so in fear that if they abuse their power, the people over whom they're asserting that power, the citizenry, will impose punishments and negative consequences. That is what a free society means, that the rulers not only have restraints imposed on them, but they take those restraints seriously because they fear the consequences of ignoring them. In a tyrannical society, it's exactly the opposite. The hallmark of a tyranny is that the people over whom power is exercised are the ones who reside in fear of people who assert power, because they know that there are no constraints that can be enforced. And I think what we have, and the reason why civil liberties abuses are so critical, is exactly that situation where, by and large, the citizenry fears the people who exert power far more than the people who fear the citizenry. And I just wanted to share a little anecdote when I first realized in a really visceral way how true that was, and I realized what the significance of this dynamic is. It was in early 2010, in January of 2010 or so, which is the first time that I ever wrote about the organization of WikiLeaks. And this was a time, January 2010, when very few people even knew WikiLeaks existed or knew what they were, including me. I had no idea what WikiLeaks was. And the way that I found out about WikiLeaks was that in 2008, the Pentagon had prepared this report that declared WikiLeaks to be an enemy of the state. It formally declared it an enemy of the state in a top secret setting. It said that WikiLeaks poses a grave threat to U.S. national security interests, and it plotted ways that WikiLeaks should be destroyed or could be destroyed. All different strategies for how it could be subverted. And ironically enough, this top secret report was leaked to WikiLeaks, which then published it on its website. And the New York Times wrote a small article about it, about how this weird transparency group led by this strange Australian had been formally declared an enemy of the state by the Pentagon, and the Pentagon was plotting ways to destroy it. And I stumbled upon this article in the New York Times. And I remember my reaction was that any group that had been declared an enemy of the state by the Pentagon and that the Pentagon was planning on destroying was a group that merited a lot more attention and probably a lot of support. And so I went and I researched as much as I could what WikiLeaks was doing, and I found that they had brought transparency to all sorts of places around the world in sort of small but significant and impressive ways. And I really realized the value that this model could bring to undermining the secrecy regime behind which the American government operates. And I wrote a long article about WikiLeaks and the reason why I was so enthusiastic about it, and I interviewed the group's founder, Julian Assange, and I posted the audio of that interview. And at the end of this article, I encouraged people to donate money to the group because I knew they were sitting on lots of important secrets, the ones that they ultimately ended up publishing to such great notice, but they were having trouble because of staff and monetary shortages, authenticating what they had in their possession, processing it, presenting it in a way that would be usable. And so I encouraged people to support WikiLeaks, and I provided a link to their PayPal and other ways to wire money electronically to their bank account. And in response to my doing that, I had dozens and dozens and dozens of people, literally, come up to me and say, in all different places, in the comment section to that article, in the email, in my email, at events like this, they said something to me along the lines of, look, I completely understand and agree with why you think WikiLeaks is such a positive cause, and I really want to support them. My problem is that I am actually afraid that if I donate money to WikiLeaks electronically by PayPaling the money or wiring them money to their bank account or any other way that's traceable, that I will end up on some government list somewhere, or even worse, be subject to criminal liability if they are ultimately declared to be a terrorist organization and I can be accused of materially supporting a terrorist group. And the thing is, these were not people prone to all kinds of wild paranoia, which, believe me, are people who I can recognize from having had lots of interaction with them. These were very sane, sober, rational people who were expressing this fear to me in lots of different ways. And the reason that struck me as so significant is because these were American citizens who were voluntarily relinquishing, out of fear, their own core constitutional liberties, which is what donating money to a political organization whose cause you support is. It's core free speech and free associational rights. These are people who were simply intimidated and threatened and bullied out of exercising their own rights. And the reason that's so striking is you can offer all of the rights you want on a piece of paper or a piece of parchment, but if you sufficiently intimidate the citizenry by creating a climate of fear, one that comes from signaling to the citizenry, as the government has done over and over the last decade, that there are no limits that we have to abide by. There are no constraints that we recognize. There are no limitations that you can impose on what it is that we can do to you. Rights become completely worthless. And it's a much more effective means of tyrannizing the citizenry than going in with black-booted thoughts and arresting and using violence against people who are exercising their power. It's more insidious. You convince people on their own to give up their rights because they fear exercising them. And what makes that so insidious is that it's very difficult at that point to even convince people that their rights have been abridged. Because if you put somebody in a sufficient state of fear and convince them to give up their own rights, they will convince themselves that they're free because they will say to themselves, there's nothing I want to do that I can't do. There's nothing I want to do that my government prevents me from doing, because they've convinced themselves that their best interest means being a passive, quiet, acquiescent citizen. The socialist activist Rosa Luxemburg put that best. She said, He who does not move does not notice his chains. He who does not move does not notice his change. If you convince the citizenry that they don't want to protest or object, when you've really intimidated them and put them in a fear of doing so, you will convince them that their prison is actually freedom. And that makes it incredibly difficult to work against these changes, to get other people to work with you, and ultimately to subvert this oppression. So I hate to close on such a negative and pessimistic note, because what happens is if you gather in events like this and just talk about all the formidable forces arrayed against you and all the horrible things that are going on, there's this risk that you can sort of spread this really awful like gloominess, you know, like, oh my God, I just listened to this guy like talk about all these horrible things and I'm ready to go just hide in my room and shut the door or jump off a bridge or something. And ordinarily I like to close by talking about the reasons why that reaction is so unwarranted. And Jacob actually touched on them. But because we're trying to constrain our time, I'm going to leave that to the Q&A session, which I know is where those kind of questions get most frequently asked. So I just want to preview that so as not to spread any sort of clinical depression amongst you, that we are going to return to that. But I do think it's important that before we talk about how all of that is happening and why it's happening so effectively. So with that, I thank you very much for listening and look forward to talking more in the session after.
Glenn reminded me of something with this sort of bipartisan assault on civil liberties that the former editor of National Review, Joseph Sobran, once said. He said that the problem's not so much conspiracies. Conspiracies imply that there's something wrong happening behind closed doors, and if we would only find out, we could discover them and put these people in jail or whatever. It's not so much conspiracies, it's consensus. When something for both parties, that's far more dangerous than what happens in secret. And Glenn sort of touched upon that and just how scary that is. Our next speaker is not only a good friend of mine, but I don't think I've ever told Bruce this, but having a background in talk radio, you know, nowadays lots of Republicans are constitutional conservatives, they call themselves. Well, during the Bush-Cheney era, they were attacking the Constitution on a daily basis, and I could always point, working in talk radio, to my friend Bruce and send them Bruce Fine videos, or on the air play Bruce Fine speeches that show them, no, there's conservatives out there who still stand up for the Fourth Amendment and the actual Constitution as it is written. So, ladies and gentlemen, Bruce Fine.
Well, thank you, Jack, and thank you, ladies and I want to address you not as a partisan, because what holds the United States together is not viewing ourselves as members of a religion or a race or a gender or sexual orientation. We're all Americans because we subscribe to certain values. We subscribe to a certain vision of what we are as a nation. And that's the way in which we ought to, I think, focus and examine the war on the Constitution, the war on our values, something that has transformed us from a republic whose glory was liberty into an empire whose glory is domination and the foot soldier, the opposite of what we were fighting for in 1776. And I want to address, I think, the current crisis in even a larger context than has been presented at present, before I go into details about the war on the Constitution, which I think is the most dangerous. But when men and women left a state of nature and organized society, there are two visions of what should be the goal, the purpose of that organization. The majority view is that men and women organized in a political community to aggrandize power and strength in order to acquire territorial control over a larger and larger number of people. Survival and empire was the goal of society. The minority view, and the one that inspired our framers, was that no, men and women form political societies and create governments in order to enable men and women to live virtuous, magnanimous lives, and that the center of the constitutional universe was the individual and individual liberty, not big government with handouts and other ways to try to undercut the ability of the individual through struggles or otherwise to find fulfillment through the assertion of his endowments, ambition, and industry. We began, as I say, as the minority view. Indeed, the first time in the history of mankind where we built into our system checks and balances for the sole purpose of restraining government, that we the people were sovereign. We didn't receive our authority because it was delegated from above, from an omnipotent emperor, God, or otherwise. We the people were sovereign. And the goal, what we viewed as success as a nation, wasn't being number one leader, like first in the NCAA rankings, you know, whatever the heck they were, leadership, you know. That is a concept of a nation that is juvenile. What we viewed as a nation was creating those circumstances in life that gave everyone a fair chance to succeed. That due process was the most important earmark of a civilized society. Due process, the most important concept in the history of civilization. The first recognition, we aren't in fact wrong. We need checks and balances. We need to hear the other side because we care about doing justice because what it says about us, not what it says about the suspicious culprit. Due process is the earmark of civilization. Checks and balances, the fragmentation of power, is the earmark of sophisticated political societies. Primitive societies ordinarily have one executive that conducts legislative, law enforcement, adjudicatory power. There's one cult figure that runs everything, whether it's the shaman or whether it's the tribal chieftain or otherwise. But our nation was different. We were exceptional because we knew that we would not be able to resist the temptations of absolute power, which corrupts absolutely. And we see it every day in the citadels of power. If we just want to ask as a quick diversion from the current occupants of the White House, the Vice Presidency, and the Secretary of State, all three candidates for the presidency in 2008, all unequivocally stating only the Congress can authorize the initiation of warfare. If President Bush attacks Iran, impeachable offense. Obama, Clinton, Biden. Year later, in the White House, presidents have no limits on unilateral wars. We can go to war against Libya, we can go to war in Pakistan, Uganda, anywhere. There are no restraints whatsoever. Well, what happened to the Constitution? I once wrote an article about Joe Biden. Says, his response, it's not that he loves the Constitution less, but he craves power and that grandiosity of the White House more that he has decided to cast aside his constitutional scruples. Understanding that the Founding Fathers had that made. We conceived ourselves as at the zenith of our recognition of what a nation should be when we were 13. That set tremors throughout Europe because they saw the values, the principles upon which we live. They were worried that it would spread like an infectious disease, the French Revolution or otherwise. And we had 6 frigates against the Britons, over 800 in the War of 1812. And they couldn't defeat us. Because, again, we viewed our vision as success, as adhering to these values. It goes back very simple. We're here not to create big government. The whole purpose is to enable the conditions to exist so we can be virtuous, free. We celebrate knowledge, not coercion. That's the goal. And that's been totally turned on its head as we've become a nation in perpetual warfare. We get candidates who say, no, America will come back. It's the American century again. We're number one. If we don't lead the world, whatever that means, all evil demons will lead the world. What does it mean to lead the world? It's the Rose Bowl parade and we're number one on the float? We go and we have votes. Like on American Idol, who's number one, sells the most coke or has the most weapons? I mean, these ideas, go back and say, they are juvenile ideas. This is serious business. It affects me and people abroad, our ability to choose our lives without fear, without worrying about a predator drone or about government spying. And we're talking about this like a football game in ranking. And say, just think of the Orwellian assignment to President Obama of the Nobel Peace Prize. You know, after he's conducted the greatest assault on the war power in the history of the United States. No one asks, well, what's wrong with that picture? With these basic premises of who we are as a people, let me go in then and talk about the war Constitution. And there are many violations of constitutional provisions that Glenn and Jacob and Jack have enumerated. But I want to focus on the most troublesome of all, even more worrisome than the president's claim to act as judge, jury, prosecutor, and executioner of anyone he wants. In secrecy, but apparently with some kind of exuberance of how great it makes him, because it was his administration that leaked all the details to the New York Times and boasted about it because it shows, hey, he's a tough guy. Yeah, I'm sure Genghis Khan is probably jealous too. But is that a reason to be boastful? Anyway, let's go back to the war power, because it really was the greatest concern that our founding fathers had about having a republic deteriorate into an empire. Almost half of the Constitutional Convention and the debates, the Federalist Papers and otherwise, focused on the standing army and all the checks that had to be built in to the Constitution to prevent standing armies, which were historically the destroyer of every single republic. And indeed, one of the reasons for the Second Amendment, which hasn't been mentioned here, which creates the right to keep and bear arms in order to protect a well-regulated militia. The reason why that was there was to provide a substitute for a standing army to come to the defense of the United States. Everyone involved in the constitutional exercise recognized the danger to a republic with armies and war. James Madison, father of the Constitution, permanent war and liberty are irreconcilable. And he was the one who was most perceptive in recognizing that the executive branch throughout all of mankind was the branch inclined to magnify, inflate danger in order to create conflict. Because in times of conflict, the executive branch gets what? The secrecy, the money, the contracts, the titles, the jingoisms, the exhilaration of trying to transform the world forever. This is the Julius Caesar, I came, I saw, I conquered. All those things incline the executive branch to invent excuses for warfare, like weapons of mass destruction, like second torpedo attacks, which were phantom, like killing a American soldier on American soil, which was a figment of James K. Polk's mind that justified the Mexican-American War. Remember the Maine, and that purportedly was blown up by the Spaniards, which clearly was false as well. All those kinds of things. Because they get the power. So in order to prevent that recurrence in the United States, the Founding Fathers, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 10. Only Congress has the authority to authorize the initiation of warfare. Indeed, if you examine the debates about the war power, no one even conceived of its use to engage in what Donald Rumsfeld, in an Orwellian way, styled anticipatory self-defense, which is to mean go blow up any country in the world because you think in 10 or 20 years they may turn out to be an enemy. There was always conceived as an exercise of defending against an attack. and whether or not Congress even has authority under the war powers to authorize a gratuitous attack on another country that's not engaged in war against us is dubious. So that entrustment to Congress of the war power was there in order to assign the decision to a body that didn't have a conflict of interest, because in times of war, the powers of Congress diminish. They're not inclined to be reckless. I would wager today, if the president does what I had urged him to do shortly after his inauguration, said, you have not authorized, and they haven't even with the AUMF, the authorization to use military force, war against Afghanistan after every single conceivable al-Qaeda involved in 9/11 has been killed. I'm withdrawing all the troops within 60 days unless Congress forces me by joint resolution to stay. Congress would not vote for the troops to remain in Afghanistan, which they say costs us $350 million a day. $350 million a day, $120 billion a year, which ordinarily finds its way into Iran very quickly to exchange for rials, because the Afghans are impoverished and they don't trust keeping dollars in Afghanistan. Who would? And this entrustment of the exclusive power to initiate war in Congress was faithfully honored by the founding generation. George Washington said only Congress can authorize the offensive use of the military. Thomas Jefferson required 10 federal statutes to authorize the use of force against the Barbary pirates, or the Beys in northern Africa. James Madison required a congressional authorization for a war in the War of 1812. And we have it really captured, that ethos, in John Quincy Adams' July 4th, 1821 address to the Congress of the United States. We do not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. We could be dictatress of the world, but it would cause our policy to migrate from one of domination and coercion. The glory of the Republic is liberty, not conquest and control. That was our prevailing ethos for the founding generation. Then it began to lose its force in American political culture with the rise of Andrew Jackson and, quote, manifest destiny. Now let's pause for a second. Manifest destiny. Manifest to who? All right. It was the first break from the idea that actually we were not destined to be a country to conquer others, because those who articulated manifest destiny conceived it as having received a mission from God to expand the territorial domain of the United States, because we were exceptional and given all angelic DNA. No other people on the planet had ever had angelic DNA built into their system, but we did. We would only do good things to people. They would crave our presence, whether by military force or otherwise. Come and dominate us. And that was the framework that led to the Mexican-American War. Without any provocation on Mexican side, decided we needed to bring liberty and freedom to that area of the globe. Now, manifest destiny then has led ultimately to the idea of American empire and domination, which is crested over the years. And although it's true that James K. Polk did have an authorization from Congress to war against Mexico, it was based upon a lie. He stated that Mexican soldiers had killed an American soldier on American soil. And one member of Congress at the time, Abraham Lincoln, introduced what he called the spot resolution, said, Mr. Polk, you tell us on what spot was on American soil where American soldiers' blood shed. And Mr. Polk, like current presidents, didn't respond at all. The House of Representatives ultimately voted that the war against Mexico was unconstitutional, supported by, not surprisingly, a then member of Congress, John Quincy Adams, who had returned to the legislative branch after serving in the presidency through 1828. The clarity of the war power is probably greater than any other provision in the Constitution other than setting the president at 35. That is, any of those who believe in the idea of original intent can't mistake what was intended by the War Clause. And it was joined by those who believed in a very muscular presidency, like Alexander Hamilton, and those who are much more suspicious of a Madison. They're all unanimous. The president cannot go to war on his own. In fact, Hamilton wrote that that was a power that was assigned to the the King of Great Britain, that was withheld from the American presidency. But as our military power grew, our arrogance grew as well. And it changed the meaning of the Constitution as it was interpreted and applied. Just as, in a different sense, the constitutional meaning of our Civil War amendments changed after Reconstruction when white supremacy reigned. And equality then meant the opposite of equality, namely separate was really separate and unequal, separate and equal. And similarly, the words of the War Clause now began to mean the president gets to decide whether to go to war or not, even though the words are the opposite, because an empire needs an executive with omnipotent authority to intervene everywhere in the world. You can't fight wars by collectives. Napoleon once said the only thing worse than one genius as a general was two. Right? You need unity of command. And that's why, as we began to move to empire, all power concentrated in the executive branch, and then we've had the last great stance against unilateral presidential decision-making was the vote against the League of Nations in the U.S. Senate. Although it was inspired by motives that were perhaps less glorious than otherwise by Henry Cabot Lodge, it was a statement by Congress they would not subscribe to the League of Nations. The Senate wouldn't ratify the treaty with authority to use the military anywhere in the world to protect any existing regime against attack. And that clearly would violate constitutional provisions. And by the way, those who argue that, well, we have a United Nations treaty and therefore the United Nations Security Council can authorize traipsing all around the globe in search of monsters to destroy, the Supreme Court has been rather categorical. A treaty cannot trump a constitutional authority or right. The name of the case is Reed versus Covert if you want to become abreast of the Supreme Court teaching on the matter. Now, we have the oddity today is that a president of the United States justifies going to war by saying he's consulted the Arab League, he's consulted, the UN Security Council and Friends of Liberty, everywhere but the U.S. Congress, They don't even make a cameo appearance in his, parading around the world and getting authority to go to war. So we have a document that's what they call a homonym of what it was in 1787. Sounds the same. It means something different. Right. Now, why do I focus on the war power as I think the most alarming that's flouted regularly by the president? And I say, as Glenn was saying, it becomes built into the American culture that it's not a subject of debate anymore that the president decides whether or not to go to war. All of the ink that you've read about whether we should attack Iran if it has a nuclear capability or nuclear weapon itself, the presidential candidates, they're not too good on memory, so they confuse capability from an actual weapon from time to time. They don't know where the red line is. But putting that aside, every single op-ed piece and story assumes only the president will decide whether to go to war against Iran. Well, sometimes it's the president and Netanyahu. You've got to consult the Israeli Knesset before we go to war. But never Congress. So how can that be? The words are so clear. But ultimately, words derive their meaning from the prevailing, political culture. And the culture is being corrupted and compromised by this vision of empire. And the empire exists, in my judgment, not necessarily because the American people crave it, I think that our so-called non-leader leaders have played on the inclination of ordinary people to be easily frightened. And so they inflate danger, safety, a millionfold. Say, oh, we're doing these things, otherwise, there'll be bodies on the sidewalks, tens of thousands, maybe even millions of casualties, unless we invade your liberty and are at warfare everywhere. All you got to do is look at one Osama bin Laden video, and you get frightened. Oh, wow. They're ready to throw us into the sea. There'll be a caliphate in Washington, D.C. the next day. By the way, they've been telling us for 30 years a nuclear weapon is going to be in the hands of Iran in a few years' time. They're still looking for it. I'm sure they'll find it somewhere, perhaps in a classified document leaked by the Israeli Mossad to our own CIA or something. The Zimmerman telegram of modern times. Right. But that's what happens in a culture that doesn't have leaders. That leaders who will tell us accept some risk in order to be free. And a proud and dignified and civilized people would prefer freedom and some risk to vassalage and absolute safety. Freedom with some risk is preferable to vassalage and absolute safety. The unexamined life is not worth living. We need to take risks, think, and make certain that what we do reflects on how we want to be perceived as a people. Not, again, on how much liberty that is denied by Osama or all these other countries around the world. So what? We need to guide our actions as to what we want to make us look like to ourselves, and whether we're faithful to our own values. So we're at a crisis, and I don't want to leave a sense, as Glenn said, of gloom here. But there's no doubt that we have come full circle. The clearest evidence is read the enumeration of grievances against King George III that were penned by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. Things like depriving Americans of a jury trial. Jury trial. I mean, as Glenn said, we don't no trial at all. You just are on the list and you're done for. The president decides you're an imminent threat to the United States. And remember, imminence is defined by the president. Mr. Alaki was an imminent threat for many years. Right? So imminent even doesn't have its ordinary meaning of going to happen suddenly. It can expend a long period of time. So you can fall within that huge expanding ambit of all individuals ready to overthrow the government of the United States, wielding a national security budget of $1.2 trillion, spending more than the rest of the world combined on national security. Oh, but they're ready to overthrow us. See, this takes, the fear factor, to almost an insane degree. But these are earmarks of all empires. As the actual threat diminishes, the fear factor climbs. And the tiniest threat becomes immediately intolerable. And you immediately respond, okay, Predator drones, throw in the military, we've got to use force. Like we're ready now to enter into war a second time in Libya, after we create the conditions that led to the killing of our ambassador. Now we've got to go back in and do it again. Then we have another ambassador killed, and then we'll go in a third time. To consider whether our actions are creating the conditions and the animosities that lead people to attack us. It's just the other people are bad people. They got the bad DNA. Lucifer is in their DNA. We have angels in ours, Gabriel and whatever. Maybe they should get a Nobel Prize for science or something for making that discovery. We are not the first generation that's confronted an enormous moral, political crisis. I was born in Cambridge, so I grew up all the the landmarks, figures, the founding generation, Paul Revere and Old North Bridge, Faneuil Hall. But also there's another figure who emerged a little bit later. His name was William Lloyd Garrison. And he was the first figure to pick up the cudgels against the evils of slavery. He began his Liberator magazine in Boston in 1833. And he was tarred and feathered, and people said, oh, Mr. Garrison, all the political forces are against you, the financial forces are against you. This is just a lark. Why are you doing this? But he persisted. He said, because slavery is wrong. It's a covenant with hell. And he persisted, and ultimately he was then president in 1865 when the 13th Amendment was ratified outlawing slavery. That was the day the last issue of the Liberator was published. All great causes begin at the bottom of Mount. Looks hopeless. And today, if you look at the trajectories, there isn't great reason to be optimistic anything's going to be happening soon. Because as Glenn and Jacob and Jack pointed out, this is where there's a consensus, not where there's differences between the Republicans and Democrats. Those are the areas that are most difficult to crack. It's a little bit like Galileo and Copernicus challenging the geocentric theory of the universe. Didn't matter what the facts were, you're going against a huge, encrusted political, ideological mindset. So we can't claim that success is going to be easy or soon. But we need to think as well that there have been many throughout history who we don't even know of. The very first person, long before William Lloyd Garrison, who said slavery was wrong. The very first person who said, you know, women shouldn't be subjugated, like this 14-year-old girl in Pakistan. They are disappeared from the place of the planet. We don't even know who they are. But somebody had to say the truth at some time to start that intellectual ferment that ultimately will prevail, because it's what civilized people do in the long run. And therefore, we can't be disheartened because, you know, we're a band of brothers, precious few. We should feel ourselves like Henry V at Agincourt. And gentlemen in England now abreast will feel themselves accursed they were not here, fought with us upon St. Crispin's Day. This is our opportunity to stand and be unflinching. Now, what does it mean with regard to your day-to-day life? It means being politically active. You can't sit it out. It means writing letters to the editor, writing columns, having debates and seminars, standing up for your rights, not being silent when you see something wrong and say, you know, it's just wrong for the United States to be killing people who are not attacking us. Indeed, you need to say, you know what the definition of aggressive war was? At Nuremberg, initiating war without the justification of self-defense, which we do every day. That's what we defined as aggressive war and prosecuted and sentenced J. Adolf Hitler's henchmen to prison for. And say, this is not to suggest that the United States doesn't have many virtues. It does. But that doesn't mean we need to blind ourselves to the fact that we have turned into a criminal state. And ladies and gentlemen, it's hard to accept. Because I, like you, grow up, we love our country. That's the fact that we have the variety of people in this room today is a testament to our devotion to equality. We've rid many parts of our population of the fetters of the handicap of birth because of gender or otherwise. We welcome them. That's good. But we can't deny we have turned into a war state. And we kill people with impunity without even shrugging a shoulder. Hey, they're not human. That's what evil rulers do. And it's hard to accept the fact that's exactly, we are implicated in that. It's our government. I'm ashamed of our government when I read, you know, we killed militants, whoever they are. Collateral damage. You know, but we offered them condolences and $2,000. We could buy them off. That's not what the nation was about when it was formed. And it's not that it was formed flawlessly. It had slavery at the time. Women couldn't vote. Catholics couldn't vote. But it built in a sense of political culture and change that ultimately led to the emancipation. But now we are the superpower. We seem to be immune to self-examination and recognizing the depth of the evil that we are engaged in. It's truly tragic that so much was given to us, and we've squandered it without really batting an eye, without standing up and saying, we don't want this kind of government. We don't want to be the dictatress of the world. We want a more perfect union here. Our influence abroad is the influence of example. But that's it. If individuals want to volunteer and play Good Samaritan, that's their freedom to do in the United States. But we're not going to emulate the Roman Empire, the Romanov Empire, all the other 72 empires that went before and fell to ruination the same way we are. So all I can suggest is that the courage, the strength that you have even to come here today will be richly rewarded in your own lifetimes and thereafter. We are standing, I think, in the highest tradition, humanity itself, in being willing to look, unvarnished at our own country and saying we need to save the people from the country that is destroying what so many devoted and sacrificed so much for all of us today. Thanks.
Thank you, Bruce, for that wonderful speech. And I think now we're going to begin the question and answer portion of this evening. Is there a certain protocol we need to, is there a microphone that's going to be? Oh, just take this over. Okay, I'm doing the Geraldo thing. Who has a question first? Oh, I'll just do, okay, yeah, that's probably a lot easier. This cord's not long enough. Oh, okay. I will do the Geraldo thing in some respect. Yes, sir.
Yeah, what kind of rights were not enshrined in the Bill of Rights or in subsequent amendments? One of the first things that the Founding Fathers understood was that by creating a federal government of limited powers and having separation of powers and checks and balances, that was a structural Bill of Rights. That is, what the Constitution did not entrust to government, they couldn't be exercised even without a Bill of Rights. Indeed, Madison initially opposed the Bill of Rights because it said you're going to insinuate the government has power to act in these areas at all when we never even authorized it to have the power in the first instance. And he was convinced otherwise by his friend Thomas Jefferson. I'm not sure what the blandishments were used to change his mind, because Madison feared has come to fruition, exemplified by Nancy Pelosi's "Are you kidding?" about the authority to enact what even Obama now calls Obamacare. Now, in the constitutional text itself is implicit the right of habeas corpus, the most preservative and protective of all rights, the authority to go to court and challenge an executive detention on the ground of its legality. It's a right that was first recognized in Magna Carta in 1215. And suspending and ignoring habeas corpus rights, we've now retrogressed 800 years. And that's complemented as progress because we are now a superpower and don't need to learn the lessons of Magna Carta. That's the most important provision. But in general, as they say, if the Constitution doesn't confer the authority on the United States, it can't exercise the power at all.
All right, we have plenty of questions. Who's next? Yes, the gentleman back here.
Yeah, I've got 3 questions.
I want to limit it to one. We got a room full of people here. Why is Obama going alone? Are we in trouble for liking Brad here today? Who wants to take that on first?
I'll talk about a couple of those. One of the interesting things that my work has enabled me to do is to basically I get drawn to these instances in which the kinds of repression that you think would not happen here actually do. So, probably 4 or 5 months ago now, I wrote about this amazing case of this woman who is a documentary filmmaker, Laura Poitras, who has produced 2 documentaries now very critical of U.S. foreign policy, one in Iraq, which showed the humanity of the insurgents who are fighting against the U.S. and the reasons why they were engaged in so much violence against U.S. forces, and then the same thing about extremists in Yemen and what has led them to become extremists. And she's now working on this incredible documentary about the surveillance state and how it has pervaded our lives. And her documentary on Iraq was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Documentary. So she's a very established filmmaker, well known in filmmaking circles. Over the past 5 years, every single time she's left the country, and then every single time that she's returned to the country, literally every single time, I think it's like 45 times now, she gets detained at the airport. So she comes back into the country, she gets detained at the airport, federal agents meet her plane. They then take her into an interrogation room. They keep her there for up to 2 hours. They ask her where she's been, with whom she was meeting, what the purpose of it was. They take her and sometimes her laptop. They copy the notebook. They then take the laptop and copy its content. Sometimes they give it back, sometimes they don't. She's never been charged with the crime. There's no search warrant that's obtained. They simply assert the power to search whatever they want and to take whatever they want of hers at the border. And this is something that has happened to American citizens as well for the crime of defending WikiLeaks and all sorts of other types of political activity. So one of the things that does start to happen is you realize that none of this gets very much attention. But one of the things that it really does start to make you realize is that the types of repression that can exist, you are able to be ignorant of if you decide that you're not really going to oppose the U.S. government in a meaningful way. And this is one of the problems, is that in every single society, typically, where there's tyrannical power, even the worst tyrannies, if you're somebody who basically decides that you're just going to go about your life and not object to any injustices, not challenge the government in any way, not be a threat to anyone in power, you can pretty much remain free of injustices. Mubarak's forces didn't just go randomly into homes that supported the government and kill them. They targeted with violence the people who were protesting. Always the people who are stepping out and speaking out and protesting the most. That's where repression lies, and it's the treatment of the people who are doing that that determines how free a society is. I mean, personally, I think you can come up with reasons as to why you could be fearful of those things. I think it's important to set aside those fears, to realize that if you have these rights, you have to demand them and insist upon their adherence, not pay any attention to those fears. I think if you have a platform and some prominence, it's harder for things to be done to you. One of the reasons why I think they were able to do it to Laura and WikiLeaks activists is because she didn't have much of a platform at the time. So I think it's very easy to kind of delude yourself into thinking that the repression isn't as bad as it is if you sort of stay away from real political dissent. But you shouldn't have to stay away from real political dissent in order to avoid this repression. And I think when you start to do the kind of work that I do and you speak to people who are targeted with these things and you go into Muslim communities in the United States, you realize just how intense it is in a way that, maybe 4 years ago, if you had asked me, do I have any fear of what would happen? I would sort of scoff at that. I take it more seriously now because I see what the government does to people all the time. But I think the important thing is not to let that deter you in any way. That's what then gives it the power.
Let me address that issue of, are we afraid to do what we do? And on the way over here, I said to Greenwald that if there's ever a major crackdown where they start exercising these powers that they now wield, he's going to be the first one they go after. And so as long as they're not going after him, I feel really safe, But the best answer, as I think, was given by Abraham Lincoln, who said, to sin by silence when one should protest makes cowards out of men. I think that pretty much says it all.
If I could just tell a short anecdote, too. First, it was Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes who said your rights ultimately are what you're willing to live and die for. And if you're not willing to die for something, don't worry, it'll be taken away by a big government. But that's what life is about, if it's more than just survival for the sake of survival. The second, with regard to the mentality, to bolster what Glenn said, there was a worker with the Ron Paul campaign who was taking a video of a manual search, physical search of two of his compatriots at the airport at Fort Lauderdale in Florida with his cell phone. This was something in the public. He was then detained by the local police and said, "You are in a Constitution-free zone." Now, I don't know whether he would withdraw and secede. Maybe this is the second secession. He didn't remember that Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, and you're not supposed to secede without the consent of the government. And he was detained. He was denied the ability to fly. He said that, well, he was invading the privacy of the TA Security Administration officials who were undertaking searching all in public place. But that's the mentality, a Constitution-free zone. I mean, even the president doesn't enjoy a Constitution-free zone under Clinton versus Jones. But those things have to be fought every way, or we certainly will lose our liberties on the installment plan rather than all at once.
Okay, we have a gentleman way back there in the back. I'm going to try to get to as many of you as possible. How can you donate to these organizations with a decentralized currency? Is the question, yes? Oh, I'm sorry. I missed that point.
So, yeah, I mean, that's such an important topic and such an interesting topic. I hate metaphors of war because we have enough actual wars that I hate to just add to the number by using war metaphors. But there really is an actual war, although not involving and jet fighters, between governments around the world and internet activists who believe that anonymity is the most crucial part of the internet. Because one of the things that the internet enables is for citizens to or in a way that very few technologies in the past have ever permitted. But that can only really work if you're able to use the internet beyond the detection and control of governments, which in turn requires anonymity. And so there are all kinds of projects underway to enable technologies to be invoked so that you can use the internet with complete anonymity so that governments don't know what you're doing on the internet, so that they're stop you as well. There's, for example, based here in Seattle, actually, and then on the West Coast as project, which is designed to send your internet activity to multiple proxies around the world in a way that's encrypted and that prevents even the most sophisticated governments like the United States and their allies from source of the internet activity. And at the same time, the governments around the world are constantly trying to stay a step ahead of what people like the Tor Project are doing and other anonymity activists are doing. And there's really like an arms race going on to see who can control the internet. And the type of currency that you're talking about, there's a few different types actually, where you can't trace the original source of the money. You can purchase it with anonymity, sort of like the way that there was an anonymity war over cell phones, so that you can purchase and donate and buy things without anyone being able to trace who it is that's doing it, are absolutely critical to having the internet obtain its full promise. And that's why internet freedom, I think, is pretty much, if not in the number one issue, certainly top 2 or 3 issues, because the internet is the tool to achieve the kind of change that we're talking about. It is central to everything that we're talking about tonight. And if we let the government take over and control and annex the power of the internet, not just through controlling it directly, but through making it impossible to act anonymously on it beyond the reach of the surveillance of governments and corporations, then its promise becomes essentially illusory. And that was really the reason why I got so involved in the defense of WikiLeaks, why I really strongly support even the vandalistic acts of Anonymous, because it's sort of a way of trying to show governments and corporations that attempts to control the internet will be always undermined and subverted. And so, yeah, I think that fight is paramount, actually.
Take this gentleman right here. Yeah, I shoot.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for showing up. Mr. Greenwald, earlier you brought up the point that things have become, like, normalized. How do you, I guess, reverse that trend? And I'd like to hear from all of you on that. Because, I mean, all sorts of things, and I'm not that old, but I was barely an adult when 9/11 happened. I've seen the evolution of things over the last years, and I'm really starting to wonder, are we past the point where things can be restored, or is it like, okay, the world's changed, life sucks?
Is your question that things that were formerly demonstrably unconstitutional now, what Glenn was speaking of?
How do you get the government to go, okay, really, no, I mean, how do you take away a power from the government that it asserts, and it's now...
How do we reverse the trend of government power going in the larger direction?
Well, I'll start, and then I know Jacob and Bruce have lots to say about that. I mean, I tell you one way that you can't change it, and that is by simply waiting around for the government to decide that it's going to voluntarily comply with the things it should comply with. That just isn't how human nature and power function. Basically, governments will always take as much power as they're able to take, and they'll stop only once they're forced to stop. And it is a difficult question to answer, especially in a venue like this. How can we change this? How versus it's the obvious question that you all should be asking, and that gets raised by this discussion. There's no pat and easy answer. So the one thing that I would say two quick things on that. One is I actually believe in the power of reason, in the ability to convince our fellow citizens who don't think about these things in this way that they should, and inspiring them to act. And I think there is sort of this sense often from people who come to places like this, like, well, you know, it just does seem sort of impossible. Resignation seems like the more rational course. I think that's really just a human temptation, like a psychological way, a defense mechanism of kind of relieving yourself of the obligation to try, of sort of softening the disappointment if you try and you fail. I don't think anybody in this room, simply by virtue of the fact that you decided to come here tonight and talk about these things instead of the zillion of other things, really believes that it's hopeless or that it can't really be changed. Because if you actually believe that, you would have stayed at home and done whatever it is you do at home instead of coming and talking about these things. The other thing I would say is, you know, there's lots of examples that should forever disabuse us of this defeatism, where throughout human history you find the most inspirational examples of people who seemed really powerless, subverting in a really meaningful way power that seemed completely formidable. And the Arab Spring is a perfect example where those populations that were kept purposely deprived for decades in all kinds of fundamental ways were able to band together and find ways to truly weaken and deliver, in some cases, lethal blows, in other cases, very serious blows to some of the world's most entrenched tyrannies that were propped up and supported and armed by the United States and other countries. And I think that should be the permanent antidote against defeatism. If you look toward the Arab Spring and see that those populations were able to achieve that, we, with our resources and our ability, should never conclude that we're unable to do so. And ultimately, the real lesson that history teaches is that every single structure that's built by human beings, no matter how invulnerable it seems, can always be torn down and modified and replaced by other human beings if the right methods are found. And if that's not happening, it's not because it's impossible, it's just because we haven't found the right strategies for doing so. And the way to find those right strategies is by continuing to congregate with people who think about these things, find more people who think about them, and find the right ways to do it.
One way is to support legislation. Now, I drafted in the last couple of years 2 pieces of legislation introduced by Congressman Walter Jones in North Carolina, and they speak volumes about the malaise, to Jimmy Carter term, of our political culture, because in a healthy society, these would be superfluous. One made it a crime for the president intentionally to lie to Congress to obtain an authorization for war, an intentional war. Now, ordinarily, you wouldn't think you needed to prohibit a president from doing such a dastardly thing. And there were hearings held on it, and members of Congress thought that was a bad idea because the president's supposed to decide on war. I said, no, sir, that's your decision. You need to have factual information. He greeted that, with astonishment, like I was from Newt Gingrich's moon colony coming here to the United States. But that's one way. And you as a voter, you decide on war and peace. I don't want the president deciding that. That's your decision. He's going to inflate danger, and you need to have the information to make that decision. So that's one way. The other, rather what I would consider modest piece of legislation was simply a House concurrent resolution. It's 107. It now has, I think, 12 co-sponsors that simply says any president who initiates war without the authorization of Congress, except in response to an actual or imminent attack, has committed an impeachable offense, a high crime and misdemeanor, within the meaning of Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution. And I can tell you, impeachment, if it actually is undertaken, has a disciplinary effect on the White House. And support for a resolution like that is exceptionally important. And you, as voters, should be demanding that anybody who runs for Congress, in order to get your vote, they've got to say, number one, they will make the decision on war and peace, not the president. Number two, they will insist they get access to every scrap of information in the executive branch, which they can do by passing a bill that I've drafted several times that simply says no monies of the United States can be expended to gather or assemble information that's not shared with Congress. That's the end of the question if they wanted to do that. And you, as voter, can exercise that influence by making that a litmus test for your vote. With regard to examples, Glenn gave one, but we have some closer to home. The most recent example was the Civil Rights Movement. For 100 years, blacks were getting lynched with impunity. And there are a lot of men and women before Rosa Parks who got wiped out, and no one even knows who they are. And yet the quest continued, and men and women and children stood unflinching before cattle prods and water hoses of Bull Connor, Jim Clark, and otherwise. They feared that if they stood up, their house would be burned, they'd be fired from their job, they wouldn't have any, they wouldn't have access to any stores, they'd be boycotted and ostracized, and they decided they had enough. And things changed. Things changed enormously. And this was after Brown versus Board of Education. Children had to risk their lives. The children were blown up in the 16th Street Baptist Church. And I say it's not something you want to insist everybody undertake because it's a terrible thing to encounter those tragedies, but it's an unfortunate fact of life that unless you're willing to take those risks, nothing seriously changes. Now, with regard to Glenn's statement about giving power back, it's amazing how adult people can be so foolish. After the election in 2008, when Obama had defeated McCain, I went to the Democrats, said, listen, you need in the lame duck session just to pass resolutions that Congress is not acquiesced in these usurpations of power of the president. I said, just to send a signal, because so much constitutional law is made just by practice. It never gets litigated for a whole host of technical reasons. So you need to make clear that these practices over the last years are not reflective of what Congress believes the Constitution says. Oh no, Bruce, Obama's our friend. He'll give us back all the power. I said, are you kidding? Can you give me a single instance in the history of the world where an executive voluntarily surrendered? Oh, but this has changed. Those were the ages when they are writing with quills. In the age of the internet, human nature changes. Yeah, that's news to me. And of course, none of that happened. And finally, we can never get discouraged. Even if it looks in our own lifetime, nothing's going to happen. We need to set a mark so somebody else, 50, 100 years, 200 years, picks it up and says, hey, they're right. Don't worry, 1776 didn't happen, in the previous 10 years. People who we don't know about stood up and argued for popular sovereignty, who argued against tyranny. And that's our role in the United States. We still have that freedom. That will be our finest hour. It's a House Congressional Resolution 107.
One of the champions of liberty in the libertarian movement is Friedrich Hayek, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, I think it was in '74. And Hayek used to talk about the results of human action, but not of human design. That things happen not because there's some overarching central plan, like the market you have here locally, but because lots of different people are pursuing their own self-interest, achieving a result that nobody plans. And I think that's the way it is for what we're trying to achieve. I don't think there's any central plan of liberty. It's going to be the results of a lot of individual actions of all of us. And you can't ever sit there and say, I'm only one person, it's not going to add up. It adds up. Everything you do, regardless of what it is, sending a letter to the editor, talking to your family, forwarding an article on the internet, standing up for what you believe, and then you add that up to the individual efforts all across this country, college campuses, communities, everything, all of a sudden it surfaces and people say, where the heck did that come from? It comes from not because somebody had a central plan for liberty, but it comes from the individual actions of people who had passion and commitment to the restoration of these ideals.
Okay, let's go to this woman right here. Are there other projects in which our internet freedoms were in bad shape?
I'm not an expert in internet anonymity. I mean, I know about the Tor project well. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't hear it well then. Right. Sure. Yeah. Well, I do think that WikiLeaks was an important example of a completely new method of combining expertise and technology in the internet with political ideals and passion, this combination, in order to really, it was really one of the first things that put genuine fear in the heart of the national security state, that this model had been created that would enable people to disclose the crown jewels of their secret state without any detection or recourse of any kind. And, I think that was with good reason that the Pentagon declared WikiLeaks to be an enemy of the state. I don't think that was irrational on their part. I think they anticipated why that was such an important threat. And that just came out of nowhere. I mean, that was really something that some people who were just thinking very innovatively were able to do with some bravery as well, and some political passion behind it. I also think that there have been a couple of movements in the United States, particularly the Tea Party movement and the Occupy movement, that were a lot more similar than people typically appreciate, that really came out of this grievance, this core grievance, that things weren't functioning the way that they were promised it would function in the United States, and that there was a recognition in both of those movements that simply going to do the thing that we were always told was what we were supposed to do in order to protest things and bring about political change, which is going to the ballot booth and voting for one of the two parties we're given, was no longer a viable means of affecting any sort of change, and that's going into the street and creating real disruption, and signaling to the people who wield power that they should start to think about being afraid, was really the only way of achieving real change. I think that was incredibly important as well. I remember reading this article in the New York Times where the Wall Street reporter for the New York Times, Andrew Ross Sorkin, he waited 3 weeks or 4 weeks while the Occupy Wall Street movement was growing and growing and growing, and he hadn't gone down to report on it because he just didn't perceive any reason to do so. And the only thing that finally made him do it was that someone, what he called the leader of one of the 5 largest investment banks, called him on the phone and said, look, what's going on with this Occupy movement? We're starting to get pretty scared. They're blocking our entrances. They seem like they're a really angry crowd. Go down there and let us know whether or not there's anything for us to fear. And being that his assignment editor, which is the head of one of the 5 biggest Banks instructed him to do so, he scampered down there and finally investigated and wrote about it. And the reason that was so significant was because it showed that people who wield this extreme power were basically without this crucial fear that keeps them in check. And that was a movement that started to impose some fear. And that, I think, is pretty inspirational as well. Whether you agree with the specific planks of either of those movements, people in Washington, people in Wall Street, people who exercise real power, for the first time were actually starting to worry that citizen unrest if they continue to cross certain lines. And so I think those are lots of different examples just in the past, 5 to 6 years of genuine movements, genuine new templates for engaging in meaningful activism that have nothing to do with attaching yourself to one of the two political parties.
I'm trying to move around the room as much as I can here. This gentleman over there. Well, there's two of you. Well, we'll do 1 and 2. Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask a question about terrorism and the rule of law.
Okay.
Again, I'd like to cite one sentence of what terrorism is in our logics, so we know what we're talking about.
We're going to have to limit these to questions. We've got little time and all that. What is your question, actually?
Right. Immediately after this is a question particularly for Glenn Greenwald, but for any of the panelists. Title 18 U.S. Code 2331, Section 2331 defines international terrorism as acts dangerous to human life, done to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion. Pretty clear, I think. My question is, you have recently, and I'm very pleased, taken up the issue of sanctions on Iran and also the violated sanctions on Iraq. But you ended the last one about Iran with an update where you said, what's the difference between violence to coerce a government and doing it by denying medicines, creating conditions of great suffering for people? What's the moral difference?
So what is the moral difference between explicit violence by the government and then through sanctions versus that?
Isn't it a legal difference? Is there any legal difference? I see the sanctions that killed hundreds of thousands of children in Iraq to overthrow Saddam Hussein as a crime of international terrorism by our own law. Could you please respond?
Are sanctions as much a terrorist act as the explicit violence our governments conduct against these nation states?
The big irony of how central terrorism is in our political discourse and all of the things that it justifies is that, well, there are two ironies to it. One is that it really doesn't have any clear meaning, the concept of terrorism. It pretty much means whatever the government wants it to mean. So it's essentially a term that means nothing and yet justifies everything at the same time. But to the extent it does have a meaning, and you read a definition in the statute, the other irony is that it's the U.S. government that marches behind the banner of terrorism all the time, that far and away is the greatest perpetrator of the acts that meet that definition. Not only in foreign countries, but also in the United States. I mean, what I was describing, which is putting the citizenry into a state of fear in order to induce them and intimidate them out of exercising core rights or challenging the government anyway, is a form of terrorism as well. And so this, to me, is one of the most crucial aspects, is the way in which language is used in order to deceive and propagandize people. And this is when we talk about things that you can do. This is one of the things that you can do all the time. I mean, if you look at the definition of terrorism, as you just did, and go and talk to people who think that the U.S. government is fighting terrorism rather than committing it, ask them how it is that going into Fallujah and killing huge portions of the male population in order to pacify the Iraqis, or engaging in what we called shock and awe, which was designed to intimidate them with a massive display of violence into surrendering and complying with our decree, is anything other than terrorism. Or what the Israelis do constantly with our support to all of their neighbors as well. All kinds of examples that meet the formal definition of terrorism. Groups that we support that engage in terrorism but do so to advance our interests. These are the kinds of things that I think need to be done more than anything, is to start to demand that we think about what these terms mean, how they're being used, how we're being propagandized by them. And terrorism is the most perfect example.
I mean, a response would be the statute does not include the United States as persons within the meaning covered. So the United States exempts itself as being prohibited by the statute. But I think the more pervasive crime of the United States, as I pointed out, it's the crime of aggression, defined at Nuremberg as meaning fighting and using war without the justification of self-defense. I mean, that goes on every single day. And if the Nazis could be sentenced for it, doesn't that mean the United States should? And then an equally, I think, egregious example is our law against material support for terrorism. That is, anybody who gives, even sews the trousers of somebody who we say is a terrorist or belongs to a foreign terrorist organization is guilty of material assistance. Well, think of all the countries in the world that engage in terrorism, and we shower weapons on them, money, all sorts of aid and comfort. Well, we should be defined as a terrorist nation then, with material support for terrorism. And we, however, don't do that. But it is characteristic of empires to be defined by double standards, even with regard to the so-called war on terror. When we kill the terrorist, it's legal because we're at war. If they fight back in self-defense, it's murder. Just think of that. That's what the legal architecture is, which seems obtuse. Why is self-defense murder in one case and legal in another? And that's what we need to really protest. It's disgusting as a country to belong to a nation that is so hypocritical to the creed and for which so many people sacrifice so much, to turn to total ashes.
Okay, I really wish I could get to everybody's questions. We have time for one more, and I already promised it to this gentleman back here. So, the final question of the evening.
Many of us believe that the war is really the war for resources, not on terrorism. And what do you say to people who say that freedom and civil liberties are only possible when you have stable economies and cheap resources? And the more we have explosive human growth and diminishing cheap resources, civil liberties should be unrealistic.
That civil liberties are unrealistic if you don't have the economic stability and the resources to afford them, I think is the question. Would you like to start, Jacob, or anybody?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's untrue that in order to basically have a society prioritize civil liberties, you first need to ensure that they have basic needs met, right? If you're concentrating on how to feed yourself or provide shelter to your family, you're not going to be paying much attention to ensuring that you have right to free speech and due process. It's just going to be the priority of how you think about things. The issue, though, is that, the assumption of the claim is that in order for us to have access to free resources or cheap resources, we need to constantly be dominating that part of the world, going to war there and the like. If you look, for example, at China, they seem to be doing quite well in terms of securing resources for themselves without having to drop bombs on countries all the time or prop up dictatorships in other parts of the world. They simply trade with those countries, maintain a kind of neutral trading posture with the rest of the world. They purchase goods on the open market. And so this idea that we need to constantly be in the Middle East in order to secure basic resources, and that's the reason why we're constantly engaging in war, I think has this really dubious assumption at the heart of it. But, what I would say beyond that is that if the government is really in the Middle East for resources, and there's lots of government documents that suggest that that is the reason why, for example, we propped up dictators for all those years because we wanted to make sure that the views of the citizens in those countries, which were very hostile to the United States, didn't end up being aired, that the dictators were basically there to get paid by us to keep the citizenry pacified and impotent so that we could do what we wanted. If that's the reason, then we ought to be clear about the fact that that's why we're over there, and then we can have a debate about whether we should be doing that, whether we need to do that, whether it's actually counterproductive. What we instead is we have this discourse that's completely disconnected from that reality. It's all about we're there because we want to secure freedom for ourselves and for them because we want to catch the terrorists. This whole kind of edifice of mythology and lies that makes even getting to your question almost impossible because it's not even the debate that we're having. So I think it's an interesting question. I think it's a debate that we ought to have, but we're so far from having it because all the layers of deceit obscuring the reason why we do those things.
I think it's a myth to think that countries go to war for resources. Oh, you could save so much money by not using the military and you just buy the resources directly. Hugo Chavez sells us oil. Iran would sell us oil if we would buy it. During the Yom Kippur War oil embargo that the Arab countries imposed on the United States, we didn't lose a drop of oil. We just bought it through middlemen. You can't keep a commodity that's global from getting to the destination from the country that's willing to pay the most money for it. Now, with regard to the idea that, well, civil liberties are a product of the gross national product, you know, the higher the GNP, the greater respect or honoring of civil liberties. I think that's a counterfactual observation. The United States, when it was first born as a nation, had a tiny fraction of the GNP of the United States today. And it didn't go to war at the drop of a hat, at least had the sense to repeal the Alien and Sedition Acts, you know, did not suspend habeas corpus, none of the civil liberties violations today when we're vastly wealthier. I remember that observation you made was said about India when Indira Gandhi was using tyrannical powers as the Prime Minister of India, which obviously is a very impoverished country, and they threw her out of office and said no. They had, even if they had few resources, a devotion to liberty and freedom despite the general penury of the population. I don't think it's not wealth that's at least GNP, that's the earmark of civil liberties. It's the political culture that honors and values it as opposed to other distractions.
Well, I think we're out of time for questions, unfortunately, and I really appreciate everybody being here today. It's been a wonderful event, and I think the president of the Future Freedom Foundation, Jacob Hornberger, has a few words to say as we finish up.
We'll be around a little bit at the end.
Yeah, we'll be sticking around, but we've got to wrap this up.
Let me express quick thanks to the organizers of this event. It's been great partnering with Young Americans for Liberty. I know that you guys have put this thing together. I know how much work goes into this. Thank you very much. And thank y'all. I know we